I'm Carol Ingall, and welcome to JTS. This is our panel discussion on head covering and modesty. For a while I was getting mixed up, and I was calling it headgear and modesty, and then I remember, no, headgear is what we were paying thousands of dollars for to the orthodontor. You know, that took care of the kids. The orthodontist kids' college education. It's not headgear. This is head covering and modesty, and we're looking at what covering one's hair represents in different religious traditions through the personal narratives of three representatives of religious traditions. I think that head covering telegraphs so many messages that can be read in so many ways, and I thank Dr. Steele for introducing us to the complexity of the messages and the reader's interpretations of those messages. We can look at head covering and think, oh, that's an example of religious identity and pride, or, oh, religious norms that are imposed by a patriarchal system. These are questions, again, that are so rich that they're, I think, best suited to the use of personal narratives to deconstruct them, because that way they'll invite conversation and questions, and a big issue for us all is addressing religious stereotypes. We've got three wonderful speakers, and they're going to speak to you from the side here, and in alphabetical order. Dr. Mary Boyce from Union Theological Seminary, Rori Neiss from Yeshivat Maharat, and Tayyibah Taylor, who is based in Atlanta and is publishing a wonderful magazine for Muslim women called Azizah. I'm going to introduce each one seriatim. So Dr. Boyce first, and she will speak to you, and we will hold questions for the end, and then I'll introduce Rori Neiss, and then Tayyibah Taylor. So again, save your questions for the end, and they will speak only for 10 minutes. You should have plenty of time for questions, and as we did in our first session, I'd ask you to line up behind a mic and come with a short, composed question, and you'll get to hear the wisdom of our panelists. So, Mary Boyce, again, no long introductions. You've got program books, but I just want to tell you a little bit about each speaker that may not be in the program book. So, Dr. Boyce, she's a very close friend, a.k.a. Mary, but Dr. Boyce has spent a lifetime furthering the cause of Jewish Catholic conversation. And she's not one to shrink from controversy. You may recognize the name from the great Mel Gibson brouhaha over the Passion of the Christ, because Mary's face was splashed all over TV, and she had interviews in the New York Times and Newsweek and U.S. News and World Report, everywhere. What you don't know is that she has a new book that is being published by Paulist Press, and it's called Redeeming Our Sacred Story, The Death of Jesus and Relations Between Jews and Christians. So if you haven't met her, meet my admired friend and teaching partner from Union Theological Seminary, Dr. Mary Boyce.
I'm delighted to be here, delighted to work with my friend Carol Ingall, but I am totally over my head in this topic. a pun intended. Especially after that wonderful talk by Dr. Valerie Steele. That was just marvelous. Well, for a relatively brief period of my life and long ago, I gave absolutely no thought to the question what to wear. I had joined a Catholic religious community of women, aka a nun. I was in the process of becoming a nun, and in those distant days, our clothing was fully prescribed. We were covered modestly from head to toe. A floor-length black serge skirt, top, and cape, and a headdress. Each of us dressed identically, no matter how tall, how short, how wide, how narrow. We each had 2 sets of the habit, one for every day and one for great feasts. Then we asked ourselves what to wear. Should we continue to dress like women of a distant era, marked by idiosyncratic clothing as a sign of our religious commitment? Should we modernize our dress, yet retain some vestige of distinctiveness, such as a simple black suit and a short veil? Or should we dress with simplicity, yet in a style that did not set us apart from other women? Our debate about what to wear was passionate. As they say, 2 nuns, 3 opinions. It was really about who we understood ourselves to be in this world, our feet firmly planted in this culture, or the cultures in which we lived and worked, because we are an international community. As we came to explore new dimensions of our being in the world, we expressed our mission as existing to promote the full development of the human person. And so it seemed to us that if we're going to promote the full development of human persons, we should work at our own development. Now, we settled this question about garb about 40 years ago. Since then, we have been living into many fascinating and intriguing and sometimes overwhelming questions, but the matter of our clothing is really settled, and I don't think about it. And I didn't think about it much at all until Carol Ingall asked me to be on this panel. So let me give a kind of a personal response about why we, members of my religious community, choose not to wear distinctive religious garb. Because the question really is not just about head covering, it's really about being marked as separate, as distinctive as religious women. So here are a number of the reasons why I choose not to be marked this way. First of all, I have a severe resistance to stereotypes about nuns. There are 2 basic sets. On the one hand, we are naive, innocent, and childlike. Or we are authoritarian, severe, and rigid. I don't think any of those adjectives exactly describes me, least of all, sweet. My friends would testify to that. There is some very interesting material in the New Testament about women and veils and clothing and so forth, and there's not time in this 10 minutes, and believe me, when Carol Ingall says 10 minutes, she means 10 minutes. That's why we have our timers set here. But in many ways, it seems to me it's connected with obedience to male authorities. Though my last name is Boyes, you have to love irony. I am not a handmaiden to male authorities. Now, there are some women's communities who do choose to wear veils, to be marked in some way by distinctive garb, and I respect that. Catholicism is a big tent, and religious communities also are big tents. But in my own community, it seems to me that our choice to be fully developed as human persons means that in some way the individuality of our persons as manifest in color and style and clothing and so forth, that is just a dimension of how we live together. So dress then expresses who we are as members of the human race. And then finally I would say, and this is probably the wrong analogy to use with this audience, but I'll try it anyway. I'm not a Tim Tebow fan. I don't need to wear John 3:16 on my face. Carol thinks I'm sort of low class because I like football.
I do not. Wrong.
But it seems to me that even having to choose every day what to wear, that's part of what it means to be in the world, and that I would never have the friends I have, I believe. I don't think I would be doing many of the things that I wind up doing were I separated, particularly were I wearing a dress of a distant era. So I'm delighted. I'm not a fashion person. I don't even like to shop. But I like to be in the world as who I am, as one more creature in God's image.
I think I really scared her.
Yeah, I'll set it for you.
You see why we love working with Mary boys. I now have the pleasure of introducing Rori Neiss, who is one of the first crop of Orthodox women learning to become religious leaders in her community, and that doesn't mean pouring the tea and running the PTA. We're talking about making religious decisions and using the title of Rabbah. Rori has been the coordinator for JOFA, which is a wonderful organization. It was one of the friends of What to Wear, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance. And for someone who looks so young, how she has packed in so much. She's taught and lectured on feminism, interfaith dialogue, and social justice in Europe, in Asia, in Central America, and even her native New York City. Rori.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to be part of this panel and with two such esteemed women that I have admired for so many years. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And I want to start off by apologizing in advance because whatever I'm about to say, I'm going to leave something out. And so I want to apologize for all of you that I'm not going to be able to adequately represent, or if you feel like there's something I've left out, and hopefully some of that will come over more in conversation. But as we've said, 10 minutes is just, we'll do broad and horrifying generalizations that I hate to do in interreligious dialogue, and I'm going to break every one of my rules right now. So please forgive me in advance. In terms of head covering in the Jewish community, I want to take a little bit more of a historical approach to looking at it, and looking back to some of the sources that we have for head covering. We see sources starting in our biblical sources of references to women who would be shamed by uncovering their hair or uncovering their head. We have references in the book of Numbers in chapter 5, which talks about uncovering the head of a woman who is accused of adultery. And we have reference in Isaiah chapter 3 also to this element of shame that comes. That's a reference to shaming of the community, and the comparison that's made is to uncovering the head of a woman in public. And so it's a little bit difficult already that some of our sources start off by talking about head covering in reference to shame, but that's where we see these beginnings. And then we see sources in the oral tradition in the Talmud that also refer to women who would have their head covered. We have a source, also a difficult source, that would talk about a woman who would walk in public with her head uncovered, that her husband would be able to divorce her without paying her dowry. And we also see a source in the oral tradition, though, that tells us that girls didn't start covering their hair until marriage. So this is some of the development that we have in terms of the history, in terms of the sources that we have. And then within those oral traditions, within those rabbinic discussions, also discussions of a woman's hair, or maybe a married woman's hair being uncovered, being compared to a woman exposing her private parts. So the notion of how hair develops, whether as married women or a single woman, some of it becomes a little bit unclear. But that development of the relationship to hair, we start to see, and very often is actually in this context of things that maybe we aren't so thrilled to talk about all the time. That actually gets codified into our book of laws in the Torah and the Shulchan Aruch, the codification of our laws, that it says that it became the custom for all Jewish women to go out in public with their head covered, and specifically says married women and single women would all go out with their head covered. Now, I'm not sure when exactly this changed, although I could say that I personally don't know of any communities in the Jewish community today that have single women going out with their head uncovered. But the custom became for head covered. Sorry, I don't know what I just said. But the custom more developed more in modern times within certain communities that women, once they were married, would begin to cover their hair. So that continues on, mostly with scarves and things like that. And then towards the end of the 18th century, we start to see this advent of wigs. And women, I think that just became popular across the board and within fashion. Women adopted this in terms of themselves. They looked at the community. They said, this is wonderful. We cover our hair anyway. We have this fashion to cover our hair with wigs, and so we'll adopt this. And so we see women in certain communities starting to cover their hair with wigs. And that was something that also faced a lot of resistance from certain rabbinic authorities, although within many Orthodox communities today is actually the standard for women covering their hair is for women to cover their hair with wigs. And that becomes a really interesting cultural sentiment that then spans across the board for different communities in terms of how head covering becomes a statement about the community itself, and where wearing a wig versus wearing a scarf, how much somebody covers their hair, where they cover their hair, what they use to cover their hair, all tends to be that message that I think Mary was talking about avoiding, of some of the stereotypes about a person themselves. And so there's a certain standard, right? If you cover your hair with a wig, that says something about you, and for positive and for negative. Every community is going to judge you based on that in one way or another, but they're going to make certain presumptions about you. And so there becomes statements that end up being made about a person based on how much of their hair they cover, whether they will wear a wig, whether the wig looks like their hair or doesn't look like hair, how recognizable it is as a wig. And all of those things just become part of that big fashion industry that we've been talking about in all of those senses. So in that sense, I think that in terms of the kind of positives and negatives that go along with it, as a part of fashion, there's certain enhancements, I think, that the head covering can make. And as you see, I do wear a head covering. I wore a black dress today, although I don't know if I should have been wearing a black scarf also. But it becomes part of this outfit. So whereas it's not a ritually prescribed dress, it's not the same outfit for each and every person. So there's an element of fun and individuality that comes forward in that, because you're able to show more about yourself, because you're able to then suddenly wear a black dress and then a shiny, colorful scarf, or vice versa, and play with that a little bit more. There's an element of individuality, but at the same time, that individuality does get stifled because of certain presumptions that communities will make. And that's true, I think, across the board with fashion, but it's no less true in terms of how we see head covering in the Jewish community. And so I think that with it comes all of those same elements. And also, what happens when your internal communal fashion norms don't necessarily jive with the broader communal norms? And so I started covering my hair once I was married, And I remember early on struggling with, because in the community that I was in, I chose, at least initially, not to wear a wig, and that was not the norm for the community that I came from. The norm, the community that I live in, is that married women tend to wear wigs, and that's the very fashionable thing to do. And so it was very uncomfortable when I would suddenly have a wedding to go to. Right? What would I wear? Because a scarf is not considered to be a fancy form of dress. It's considered to be pretty low class. And so then it became more normal to wear things like hats or to wear fedoras. And so I would have fun and I would buy hats and things like that. And all of a sudden I found myself getting invited to business meetings and suddenly learned that fedoras aren't really what you're supposed to wear to a business meeting. So within that element, there's a lot of difficulties that come along with it. And I think that it's something that could be challenging for a person, but also does open up a lot of opportunities for some of that individualization to come through within that. And I think more broadly than that, for myself, not really thinking of it so much within the notion of modesty personally, but really also thinking about it as that connection to the broader community. And so for myself, coming from a community of women who cover their hair, although still being somewhat individual by changing my choices for how I do it, for me it still gives me that same connection to my community, and in a very outwardly recognizable way.
Regarding the specific issue of Jewish women in head covering, we've got a great resource for you to look at in your program book. We didn't want to put down bibliography, but we put down for sources for further exploration. There's a wonderful film by a young filmmaker on her choices, very much like Rori's, on how she dealt with this question. Last panelist, we have this Hebrew expression, acharon, acharon, chaviv. The last one is the most beloved. Yeah. Tayyibah Taylor. Tayyibah was born in Trinidad, grew up in Toronto, lived in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, and now that foreign country, Atlanta, Georgia, where she has become the force in the world of fashion for Muslim women by being the editor-in-chief and publisher of Azizah magazine. Like Rori, she too is a worldwide traveler. She's traveled to Turkey, Spain, Morocco, Jerusalem, Greece, and Jordan with groups of Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And she has more than 100 papers and publications with her name, all of which helps to make her one of the most influential Muslim women in the United States, and we're honored to have her here at JTS today.
Thank you. I begin in the name of God, most gracious, most merciful, and greet you all with greetings of peace. And I'd like to thank Dr. Ingall for inviting me to be here. It's really a thrill to be here. Thank you so much. So before I talk about covering the hair, I think I'd like to first set the larger context for Muslim women and Muslim women who are practicing their religion. And there's a verse in the Quran that says, وَمَا خَلَقَتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسُ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُوا. God speaking, saying, I did not create the human being and the invisible beings except for the purpose of worship. So the larger context is that our lives is for worship, and the purpose really is to gain the highest level of God consciousness possible. So with that in mind, then we can talk about clothing and prayer and everything else. Clothing is mentioned several times in the Quran, and I wanted to end the head covering in particular. And when I was listening to Chancellor Eisen this morning, I was really struck when he said the three qualifiers, because that's what really I was thinking about, dignity, beauty, and meaning. And those are the three things that clothing take on from the Islamic context. one of the first things that jumps out to me is a verse in the Quran that says, and tell the believing men oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry, got the wrong one. It says that we have created clothing for you as an adornment and to cover your private parts, so that is dignity and beauty. And it says, but the best clothing, libas al-aksan, the best clothing for you is God consciousness or piety or righteousness. So the idea of piety being part of our clothing is an integral part of our context. Then when we start talking about the women themselves and the head covering, there is a verse in the Surah An-Nur that talks about, and tell the believing women. Now, the verse that I spoke about before that says, "O Bani Israel, Bani Adam, O children of Adam," it is talking about the whole of humanity. We created clothing for you for women. So this is a qualifier. It's only for women who believe there's a spiritual dimension or a spiritual repercussion for what they have on. It's not for everybody. So this is not to say that all women should be wearing covering their hair. It's for women who have who hold a connection, a spiritual connection to their clothing. And as we know, we hold perhaps cultural connections as well as, this morning I thought, am I going to be warm enough? We wear different clothings for different reasons. And one of those is for a spiritual connection. And so this verse in Surah An-Nur, in the chapter called Chapter of Light, where it says to tell the believing women to throw part of their khimar over their chests and do not expose their beauty or accept what necessarily appears thereof. And so this word khimar, some people interpret it to mean the head covering, and some people just interpret it to mean something that you would throw over your chest. And another verse in the Quran, it says in Surah Al-Ashab, O Prophet, tell your wives and the daughters and the women of the believers to put when they go abroad to wear something over their outer garments. That is more suitable for them, and they will be known as such and not abused. So here's the meaning, that you will be known as a woman on a spiritual path and not be insulted or abused. Sometimes that gets flipped around in these days, but I think that for me personally, and let me back up first, I would say, so when you see a Muslim woman, you can't necessarily assume that she's wearing it because she this is demonstration of her piety or her spirituality. It may be that she is doing it because of the society pressures in Muslim majority countries. Sometimes the government tells you have to wear this. It may be that she's getting pressure from her husband or her parents. It may be that she's having a bad hair day. Or it may be it's that she truly feels that this is a reminder that she's, to herself and others, that she is on a spiritual path. And I think it's interesting that for me as a Muslim woman, I have the right to lie naked on the beach in France or some other European countries, but I don't have the right to cover my hair and work in a government building or for the government. And I think that it's very important for women, because we're all on different spiritual levels or all different, we have all different frames of references and perspectives about life, spirituality, religion, that we all have the freedom to wear what we want to wear. So I think it's interesting how the covered woman sometimes is depicted or is associated with backwardness and old-fashionedness and sometimes ignorance, and whereas the uncovered woman is a signal of modernity. And I find that very interesting, not only from a issue of equality, but more so politically. I think it's interesting that the uncovered woman is the one that has been put out as the more progressive one. And what does that say to us about as women? I think that for centuries and centuries, women have basically had the same outfit, long dress and sometimes a hat or sometimes a scarf. And I always kind of found it strange here in this country that around the same time that we got the right to vote, say, have a political say, the hemline started going up. And it was almost we signed this invisible contract saying, okay, you can have this power, political power, but, take off some clothes that you will remember that you're first a physical being, first a sexual being, second an intellectual or a spiritual being. And for me, the headscarf really demands that others look at me first as an intellectual or a spiritual being, and second, third, way down the line as a physical and a sexual being. And I find that for me, it's a very strong feminist statement. It's not one of being oppressed. Again, that's not the story for all Muslim women. You can't typify it. But for most of the Muslim women in this country, where you have the freedom of dress, the freedom of movement, the freedom of expression, I think it is a one of choice. I think it's interesting how people have 5 children. One of my daughters has many piercings and tattoos, and they see her piercing and tattoos as her expression of freedom and individuality, but my covering as something that as oppressive. And I think when we look at how we privilege one frame of reference when it comes to how we express ourselves over another. In Muslim-majority countries, women are told you have to cover up and you have to be silent, and if you enter public space, then you become a sexual being. And in the West, we uncover women and use their bodies to sell excitement at football games, and I think on both sides, women are being used and commodified. And I see a connection. I think this is another seminar, but I do see a connection of the commodification of women and the undressing of women, and the undressing of women connected to the commodification of women. Thank you.
I'm going to ask you to line up at the mics, and while you do that, I'm going to take advantage of my privilege of having a mic right here. And I'm asking a question for all of the panelists, and I told them I was going to ask this. So I wanted to know, what are the pluses and minuses of the particular choice that you've made regarding head covering? And would you discuss a time when you felt that your choice made you feel as if it were an unfortunate choice, when you were uncomfortable or wished maybe that you had chosen another path on this journey towards figuring out what to wear or what not to wear? So, does anybody want to start?
I'll take that. I grew up, as Dr. Carroll said, born in one country. My parents were from another country. I grew up in a third country that married a man from New York and ended up here. So wherever I am, I'm always the other. And I was very blessed to have parents who taught me, don't be responsible for others' assumptions about you. So that meant I could be a rebel. That was my interpretation of it. So I try not to take on other people. I do not take responsibility for other people's assumptions. And sometimes that means me having to explain things to people. And it's a test for me to do it from a place of genuine concern for another human being or another spiritual being, and not for a place of ego and anger sometimes. The only times I feel that it's unfortunate is when there's political things happening and the association of a covered Muslim woman with terrorism and that being an automatic. So every time I go to the airport, it's an issue. They say random, and I say, does random mean every time for a random check? But now, for the last few years, I actually have a pacemaker, so I do have to go through a scanner, a special scanner now. But coming here from Atlanta yesterday, the woman said, do you have something in your leg? Is there some kind of implant or metal in your leg? And I thought, my leg?
Hip.
So I was going to make a joke and say, yeah, the aliens put it there when they abducted me. But that kind of thing you can't do anymore, so.
Rori, want to give it a try?
Happily. I'll say in two elements. The first is that there was something that was actually really very meaningful and powerful for me, that there was some very physical marker that changed with me when I got married. And that was actually a very interesting experience that I wasn't fully prepared for. And it actually felt very appropriate for me that having gone through this very big, momentous change in my life, that there was something that outwardly reflected that. And so that was something that I actually very much appreciated about the head covering, although I really struggled for a very long time about figuring out how to go about doing that and making sure that I tied it right and it didn't fall off as I was walking and things like that. But the other component of it is, as was mentioned, I'm involved in a lot of interfaith activities. And that's been a very interesting experience for me. Then in terms of having my hair covered, both in my work within the Jewish community and then in my work in interreligious contexts. And on the one hand, it's been very positive, I think, for me to be so recognizably both Jewish and of a certain type of Judaism, let's say, and to then shatter some of those stereotypes that we talked about before. And so what it means for me as a woman who covers her hair and wears skirts or dresses to be traveling to Malaysia to spend some time with Muslim women and to be doing all these different things, I like to think is a very positive element to it. But there's two very short anecdotes that I want to share within that of some of that kind of positive and negative. The first is that this past summer, I had the great fortune to travel to Poland with a Jewish Christian Muslim group of young people and Jewish and Christian adults, so to speak. And we traveled as part of the trip to Auschwitz and Birkenau. To have this interreligious experience there. And I had actually never been to Auschwitz or Birkenau, and so that was very powerful for me to go with this group of people that I'd just been spending a few days with. And while we were there, a Muslim woman and I had actually become very close friends, and we were roommates for the trip, but we were not standing next to each other as we were doing this meditative walk through Birkenau. And we were at one of our stops on this meditative walk, and we were silently in prayer. And somebody else from this group, from this interreligious group, taps me on the shoulder and then pushes me so that I would stand next to this Muslim woman who she didn't know was my friend, but she didn't know that we had become close, who was wearing the hijab, so that she could take a picture of a Jewish woman and a Muslim woman at Birkenau together. And I imagine goes back home and is showing everybody all of these strides that we've made, and yet the picture was completely constructed. While there may be truth behind the picture, it was not a true picture. In this past winter, I was traveling to Israel and the Palestinian territories with a group of Jewish and Christian seminary students, and we were taking a day trip to, I believe it was to Bethlehem, that we were there for 2 days. And just before we were about to leave, they kind of gathered the Jewish students together, and they said, we've taken all precautions, and everything's going to be safe, and we've done all of these things, and don't worry, but maybe try not to look too Jewish. and I was the only, it might have been the only other Jewish female on the trip, and I kind of looked around and said, seriously? So there's those moments, and within that, I think there's still those positive negatives. Even in those times, there's times like that I wish that I could just kind of change how I look and make it easier to pass within that. Although at the same time, I think there's also a really important statement that gets made when I'm not able to, even if it doesn't always feel like that's, even if sometimes I feel constrained by that.
There are a lot of people lined up at the mic, so I'm going to be very brief. I think one of the few times that I wondered if religious garb would be useful was when I joined some others in my community in protesting against the war in Iraq. And so we made a sign, Sisters of the Holy Names for Peace, or something like that. there's
Okay. Very. All right. She was. Oh, you're so polite. So good. All right. Okay. Yes.
Hi. So this is sort of addressed to Ms. Taylor and Rori. Forgive me, Dr. Boyce. So you were talking a lot about the hijab as spiritual. You didn't really bring up. Well, let me put it this way. When we talk about women covering or uncovering their bodies, it's always about sexuality. And Dr. Steele made a comment at some point during her talk about not being able to escape our gender, and I bristled a little bit at that. But I mean, it's kind of true. You know, regardless of how we're addressing women's bodies, it's always about sexuality. And I don't know. I guess I'm interested in the fact that when you talk about covering the head, you really only talk about it in terms of a spiritual signifier, and you didn't bring in sexuality or sexual signaling until afterwards, when you talk about Western and Eastern, Eastern, whatever we want to actually call that.
What's your question?
So, sorry. Part of it is that I'm interested in the relationship between men's head coverings and women's head coverings, and how you understand the dynamic of that. And that question is also kind of addressed to Rori in terms of like Kisui Rosh for men and women, and how you understand that dynamic.
Well, I think primarily it is a spiritual thing. As I said, the grand purpose is really to gain the highest level of God consciousness possible. And in doing so, you inculcate certain characteristics. One would be honesty, one would be piety, one would be modesty. And in modesty, it's not simply modesty of dress, it's also modesty of behavior, modesty of ego. And so there's a lot of dimensions to it. Sometimes I think that when we're dressing, I think sometimes women's dresses, we saw in some of those pictures, were really about sexual manipulation of men or women on a level that is really, I think, would be contrary to someone who's trying to attain a certain spiritual level. So primarily, for me, it's spiritual. For others, maybe it might be simply sexual. I do think that when I wear a scarf, I said I demand that you look at me not as a physical body or a sexual being, but as an intellectual person first, hopefully, or a spiritual person first, because for me, I am a spirit before I am a body. So that's the demand the headscarf makes for me.
Rori?
I want to agree with everything that was just said, and to just add on that I think that within the Jewish community that women have actually taken back a lot of this dress and head covering, and some women have actually, I think, inserted this sexuality back into it. And I think that if anyone has seen in any of the communities some of the wigs that people spend $10,000 on, it could be any given wig, or the clothes or things like that. There's entire industries of fashion that create clothing that cover the elbows and cover the knees and reach the collarbone, but I think would be considered incredibly sexy clothing. And so I think that that's something to really just echo, is something that's very internal to the person. I think that when you put on the clothing, you're saying what it is that you're portraying. And if you put on clothing that's quote-unquote modest, but saying it in a way that you're looking to be, that you want to look sexy, I mean, I'm not trying to demonize that, but if that's your choice, then that's how you look. And I think that not wearing that kind of clothing, wearing clothing that's shorter or lower, but not evoking that could also be far less sexy. And I think that that applies then for men and women alike in terms of what it is that they're giving out, what it is that they're trying to project, thank you, and how they're seeing it for themselves. And so I think it could be spiritual in both senses for covering hair or not, and it's really completely up to the individual person.
Okay. Yes.
Hi. First, I'd like to say that I happen to agree with Tayyibah and the concept of covering up being a feminist issue, and that I always thought that God was the first feminist with the directive as to being modest. And especially that as after having 2 boys and now having a daughter coming of age, it's really an issue for me. But at the same time, something that you said was that in the Quran it says, if you cover your chest and you go, then they will know that you are on a spiritual journey, and that they will not harass you or assault you. And I found that a little bit disturbing, because that definitely sounds like a sexist issue. And the same thing with something that Rori, of course, did not touch upon, which is, the concept of when a woman gets married, it says in I think the Maharat, Isha Niknet, a woman is bought. And the whole concept of a woman as chattel and the covering the hair signifying that she is taken. I mean, the same concept of...
And your question?
Is how they work it in and how they work the two of these things together. I mean, if we go into the concept of what is the things that you have to die for, and one of them is it's not rape, it's adultery.
Okay.
Well, definitely, I think the whole issue of the female body is there. Female body has been abused and molested, I think, as sometimes as a weapon of war, sometimes for entertainment. Again, the whole commodification. It was a specific at that time that women were being abused, but it's also, it's sometimes in Quran you have to acknowledge what is khas and what is am, what is universal and what is specific. That was addressing a specific issue. However, it can also be a universal in that it tells other people, as we were saying, it projects to other people that you are a woman on a certain path, spiritual path. I know that as I'm walking down the street, people will not say, "Hey, what's up underneath that skirt?" I don't get the sexually provocative comments. Then before I used to dress much differently.
Mary wants to get into the conversation. You did. You told me.
I was writing a note. I shouldn't be reading over my shoulder. These things are very particular to the various cultures and traditions. So I would just say I can hardly remember the years when I wore the habit. I mean, I was also very young then. But it was like a magnet to drunks. A long bus ride and never mind. It's not a pretty story. But also, when we made the decision to not wear the habit, it was a journey into our own sexuality. So, nuns are sexual beings too. The stereotypes don't allow for that, but it's the case. Yeah.
Rori, do you have something to say?
I'll just try to briefly respond to the question and saying that I actually think very separately about the notion of the language that we use for women in terms of marriage and the head covering. And I think that what you raise is a perfectly wonderful, really profound question in terms of how we go about using that language. And I don't want to get into all of that discussion and the apologetics for it or other conversations that we could have with it. But there's plenty of people who use that language in terms of the marriage ceremony and choose then not to cover their hair. And I think covering your hair also has evolved culturally, even though related to marriage, not specifically as a sign of being purchased within the concept of marriage. So I do appreciate the criticism in terms of the language that's used, but it's difficult for me to really see I don't feel that the head covering as a notion of being purchased in any sense.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
Hi. So what I'm wondering, it sounded to me when the panelists were describing their own choices to cover their hair, that this was a voluntary choice. Mm-hmm. And to my mind, that's in contrast, for example, to if you're following religious dietary law, I don't think you would consider it a choice. It's something that God's required of you, and you're doing it because it's required of you, not that you're making a choice.
So your question is obligation.
Right. My question is, to what extent do you feel that covering your hair is your choice, and to what extent do you feel that it's an obligation? Right.
Great.
That it's mandated by God.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all a choice. It's all a choice. You choose to follow. I can choose to get up for morning prayer or not. I can choose to cover or not. There are many Muslim women who choose not to cover in public. The thing about the scarf, when they stand to pray, all Muslim women still wrap their heads when they pray. So it's a choice. Everything that you do is really by free will. You're choosing. You choose how to negotiate your own acceptance of the religion. I mean, I know some Muslim women who wear miniskirts. So it's still within that. You're still choosing. You're still choosing.
Rori, what about chiyuv?
I'm not really sure what I can add to that, because I think that at the end of the day, that's really the same answer that I can give. And I think that I will say that one of the things that I learned from some of my Muslim friends, actually at a conference where I met Tayyibah, is somebody was talking about their decision to cover their hair, and she said, "I decided it today, and tomorrow I'll decide tomorrow." And the idea wasn't so much in the sense of this notion of where do I believe that the law comes down, because I think that the law has interpretations, and we can all talk about our own interpretations of the law, and we could have an internal Jewish conversation about how we define the law and where we see it, and that's part of that choice. But even within that, even if I recognize whether dietary laws or whatever it is, I make the decision right now that this is what I'm going to eat, and then tomorrow is going to be its own day. And I think that that's really important framing in terms of religion as a whole, right? Because we all slip, we all do things that we think are wrong, and then the next day we get up, and the question is, what do we do then? Is it over and done with, or do you make that decision again? And so I think that there's a separate layer of choice, separate from how you understand the law to be, to where you see yourself in relation to that obligation.
Mary, what about Vatican II, and what about Vatican II being undone bit by bit?
Yes. Well, I just want to go back for a moment, so it's not simply a matter of choice. We have texts in the New Testament. For instance, in the first letter to the Corinthians, Paul says that any woman who prays in public or prophesies without her head being covered is disgraceful. Now, that text was never one that was used in my community. I mean, in the Catholic tradition, I didn't hear it cited a lot. But the question is, what about the cultural conditioning of our sacred texts? I mean, to me, that's the larger issue. And I haven't done a lot of work with this text from 1 Corinthians, but I did a little exegesis, and it seems that in the certain classical authors, the hair was considered part of female genitalia. Now, we have a different physiological understanding today, so it seems to me that to sort of go into the New Testament and handpick this text from Paul to justify or to require head covering is to miss the point, I think, of what Paul was saying, which was really more about dignity in worship for all people, men and women. So just briefly, Vatican II, which was the opening of Vatican II is just about 50 years ago now. And it was a time when it was really an opening of the church to the world. And yes, we have a very contentious argument now in the Catholic Church about its meaning. And to a certain extent, that's a gender argument. I'd like not to go too much further into this right now. But it's a very, very difficult argument, and you may have seen a certain full-page ad in the New York Times on Friday.
Yes.
Thank you.
I think we'll have one more. I hate to do it, but that's why we'll have conversations over lunch. But yes.
This is a question for Rori. Others should feel free to comment. This is all I know of within the Jewish community. I know of women who basically use the modesty represented in head covering and trade it off with modesty represented by their physical body clothing, meaning if they want to wear a thin headband instead of a full scarf or wig, they'll wear more modest clothing, like a longer shirt and a longer skirt. But if they want to wear a bigger hat, they'll feel more comfortable to wear a shorter skirt and a shorter shirt. What are your thoughts on sort of this trading, quantification and a trading of modesty as a unit on the body, shifting and separating it from head covering as an entity unto of itself?
That's actually not something that I've come across personally. So
I'm from Toronto. Maybe it's just a Canadian
I
thing.
find that very fascinating. Although it sounds like a perfectly logical thing that somebody thought of. So I'll trust you on that. I think it really goes back to some of what we were saying before in terms of, I think modesty is something that's much more profound than anything that can be defined by clothing or head covering. And I think it's something that has evolved through our communities and our cultures to be defined because it's a difficult notion to give over. It's difficult to tell somebody to be modest. It's much easier to tell somebody what that looks like. And it's easier to tell somebody, this is how much hair you show or don't show, or how much of your knee, or if you sit or if you stand, and I think it's a much easier thing. But I think at the end of the day, what I'm taking from all of the people here, and what I hope is coming across also, is that I think modesty is very much something that comes from within the person. And I think that we then take advantage of some of these other structures in different ways, but that's something that we're all going to make that decision on. So it's interesting for me in that cultural sense, where somebody might feel like they're within this community, and so that keeps them within the community because they're abiding by certain letters of the law and then maneuvering with other parts. And I think that's part of us all trying to push our individuality through within those confines of modesty. And that's the other piece that I've really been hearing from everyone here. And so I think, and I know for myself also, it's something that I've played with and struggled with, but tried to really make my own. And so I think with everyone, it's this notion of, I'm having a really good hair day today, and it's really hard to put on a scarf sometimes on those days. And so maybe somebody wants to because at the end of the day, I think, like Mary was saying, I think women are sexual beings, and the idea of having to hide that, to be more in control of that, how you want to manifest that, how you want to show that, how you want to be seen in that. But there's times where people want to look however they want to look. They want to be appreciated. They want to feel pretty. They want to feel sexy. And I think that that's a perfectly valid feeling. And so how people then go about maneuvering it, though, is very interesting. And everyone's going to kind of do it within those boxes that they feel themselves in.
Thank you very much.